My husband's watch was gone, and my son told me he sold it. The words hung in the air like something that didn't belong in a family conversation. Cold. Clean. Final. I was sitting across from my son, Daniel Brooks, in the office of my late husband's attorney. My hands were folded in my lap, steady on the outside, though something inside me had just shifted. Lauren, my daughter-in-law, didn't even look uncomfortable. She sat beside Daniel like this was a routine business meeting, not a confession that had just cracked open something sacred. "It was just a watch, Mom," Daniel said again, exhaling like I was the one being unreasonable. "You weren't even wearing it. It was sitting in a drawer for months." I blinked slowly. "That watch," I said quietly, "was your father's last gift to me before he died." Lauren gave a small laugh. Not loud, just sharp enough to hurt. "Honestly, Margaret," she said, tilting her head, "it was just collecting dust. We sold it at a good price. You should be glad we didn't let it sit and lose value." That word, stayed in my mind longer than anything else. I turned my eyes back to Daniel. "You sold it together?" He didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was enough. Then he nodded. "Yeah, we did. And we already used the money for some family expenses." Something cold moved through my chest, not grief exactly. Something sharper. Recognition. Humiliation spike. Family expenses. As if the watch of a man who built this family meant nothing more than a line in a budget. I looked down at my hands again. My wedding ring was still there. Robert's ring had been buried with him. But the watch, that watch had stayed with me. It was the last thing he ever placed in my hand. Lauren leaned back slightly, crossing her legs. "You've been struggling with bills anyway," she added casually. "We just handled it before things got worse." Before things got worse. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because I suddenly realized how long they had been deciding things for me without ever asking. A silence stretched between us. Thick. Controlled. Not awkward for them. Only for me. That's when the attorney, Mr. Carter, finally cleared his throat. "I think," he said carefully, opening a leather folder on his desk, "there is something else you should understand about that watch." Daniel shifted slightly. Lauren stopped smiling. I didn't move. Mr. Carter slid a sealed document forward, but didn't open it yet. "Your husband didn't leave it as a personal item," he continued. "He placed it under a private clause." "A private clause?" Daniel let out a short laugh, trying to regain control of the room. "It's just a watch, sir." "Seriously?" Mr. Carter looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't." Something in the way he said it made the air feel heavier. Lauren's hand tightened slightly around her purse. Just a small movement. But I noticed. I always noticed things people thought I wouldn't. Mr. Carter continued. "Your husband suspected that certain decisions might be made without Margaret's full consent in the future." The room went still. Daniel's expression changed first. Not anger yet. Confusion. Lauren, however, didn't look confused at all. That was the moment I felt it. Not just suspicion. Confirmation. Something had been happening long before today. I leaned forward slightly. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked. My voice was calm. Almost too calm. Mr. Carter met my eyes. "I'm saying your husband left instructions that activate if any attempt was made to sell or transfer that watch without your direct approval." Silence. Then Daniel laughed again, but this time it didn't sound natural. "That's impossible. We handled everything legally." Mr. Carter slowly opened the folder. "That's what we need to verify." He pulled out a second envelope. This one wasn't sealed for protection. It was sealed for timing. "For you, Margaret," he said gently. "Your husband asked me to give you this only under one condition." He paused. My heartbeat didn't rise. It steadied. "What condition?" I asked. Mr. Carter looked at Daniel. "If the watch ever left your possession without your consent." Lauren shifted in her seat. Just slightly. But I saw it. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I didn't feel like I was reacting to something already done. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something that had been prepared long before I even noticed the cracks. And then Mr. Carter placed the envelope in front of me. "Margaret," he said softly, "your husband wanted you to decide what happens next." I didn't open the envelope immediately. I just held it. It felt lighter than it should have. Almost ordinary. But nothing in that room felt ordinary anymore. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "Mom, don't turn this into something it's not," he said quickly. "We were just trying to simplify things for you." Simplify. That word stayed with me longer than anything else he had said. Lauren leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. We didn't do anything wrong, she added. It was just an old watch. It wasn't being used. Humiliation spike. Not from the words. From how rehearsed they sounded. Like this conversation had already been practiced without me in it. I finally looked at my son. You sold your father's watch, I said slowly. Without asking me. Daniel sighed, rubbing his forehead. Mom, it's not like that. You're making it sound emotional. It was an asset. It had value. An asset. Not a memory. Not a gift. Not the last thing Robert ever placed in my hand before he left this world. Just an asset. I turned my eyes to Mr. Carter. What exactly is in this envelope? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed both hands on the table. Before I open it, he said carefully, you need to understand something your husband made very clear. Lauren shifted in her seat. Daniel stopped moving. Even the air felt like it had tightened. Mr. Carter continued. Robert Brooks did not trust that all decisions regarding his estate would always be made with your consent in mind. A pause. That sentence landed harder than I expected. Not because it surprised me, but because part of me had already felt it long before anyone said it out loud. Daniel shook his head immediately. That's ridiculous. I've been taking care of everything. Mr. Carter looked at him calmly. That's exactly the concern. Silence. A heavy one. The kind that doesn't just fill a room. It pushes people apart inside it. Lauren suddenly leaned forward. So what? Is this supposed to mean, she asked sharply, that we did something illegal? Mr. Carter didn't respond to her. Instead, he looked at me. This means, he said quietly, your husband built a system that only activates if someone crosses a very specific line. My fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. Daniel let out a short laugh. Over a watch. Mr. Carter shook his head once. No, he said again. Not over a watch. That was the second time he said it. And the second time it made the room colder. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single document. No thick stack of papers. No dramatic reveal. Just one page. But when he placed it in front of me, I noticed something immediately. Daniel saw it too. His expression changed. Not confusion this time. Concern. Lauren stopped breathing for a moment. Mr. Carter pointed at the top line. This clause, he said, activates full control reassignment of a hidden trust account. Daniel's voice sharpened. Hidden trust. Mr. Carter nodded. Yes. One you were never authorized to access. Lauren stood up halfway. That's impossible, she said quickly. We handled all the estate filings. Mr. Carter looked at her for the first time. You handled what you were given, he corrected. A pause. Then he added, not what was concealed. My chest tightened slightly. Not fear. Not shock. Something slower. Recognition building from pieces I had never been allowed to see before. Daniel turned to me. Mom, you knew about this. His voice dropped. I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was simple. I didn't. Not until now. Mr. Carter slid the paper closer to me. This trust, he said, was designed to remain inactive unless the watch was sold or transferred without your consent. Lauren suddenly spoke again, her voice tighter. So what happens now? Mr. Carter looked at her, and then at Daniel, and finally at me. Now, he said, we confirm who authorized the sale. A long silence followed, and for the first time since I walked into that office, I realized this was no longer about a watch. It was about what my husband expected would eventually happen, and what he had prepared for long before any of us admitted it out loud. I slowly placed my hand on the document, and opened it. The document was open in front of me now. One page. No dramatic formatting. No bold warnings. Just legal language that felt heavier than anything I had read in my entire life. But before I could fully process it, the room shifted again. A knock came at the door. Everyone turned. Mr. Carter didn't look surprised. Daniel frowned. Lauren's expression tightened immediately. Are you expecting someone? Daniel asked. Mr. Carter didn't answer. The door opened anyway. A man in his late 50s stepped inside. Neatly dressed. Controlled posture. The kind of presence that didn't belong to family tension, but to old paperwork and long memories. His eyes found me first. Margaret Brooks? He asked carefully. I nodded slightly. He stepped in. My name is Edward Sinclair, he said. I used to manage private asset verification for your husband. Daniel straightened instantly. Who let you in here? He asked sharply. Edward didn't look at him. His attention stayed on me. I asked to be notified if certain conditions were triggered, he said calmly. And they were. Lauren's voice cut in. What conditions? Edward glanced at the document on the table, then at Mr. Carter. And finally, he said the words that changed the atmosphere completely. The watch has been sold. Silence. Not confusion this time. Impact. Daniel immediately responded. Yes, we already told you that. So what? It was just a personal item. Edward shook his head once. That's not what your father considered it. Humiliation spike. Daniel's jaw tightened. Stop talking like that. You didn't even know him personally. Edward finally looked at him. I knew him well enough to know what he built and what he feared. Lauren stepped forward slightly. What does that mean exactly? She asked. Edward ignored her question and turned back to me. Margaret, he said gently, did you authorize the sale of the watch? The room went still again. This time, even Daniel didn't interrupt immediately. I looked at him. My son. The boy I raised. The man sitting across from me who now avoided my eyes like I was part of a decision he had already finalized. No, I said quietly. One word. That was all it took. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was shifting. Edward exhaled slowly, almost like he had been expecting that answer. Then he reached into his briefcase and placed another sealed folder on the table. Lauren immediately shook her head. This is ridiculous. We already explained. Edward interrupted her calmly. No, you explained what you chose to do. He turned the folder slightly toward me. This, he said, is what your husband prepared if his trust conditions were violated. Daniel laughed once, but it sounded forced. Trust conditions? Over a watch. Edward didn't respond. Instead, he said, your father did not leave behind a watch. A pause. Then, he left behind a trigger. My chest tightened slightly. Not fear. Not shock. Something more precise. Understanding forming too late. Edward continued. When the watch was sold, it activated a verification sequence. Lauren's face changed. Verification of what? She asked quickly. Edward finally looked directly at her. Decision authority. Silence dropped instantly. Daniel frowned. That doesn't make sense, he said. I have power of attorney. Edward nodded. Yes, you did. That did landed harder than anything else. Lauren's voice sharpened. What do you mean did? Edward opened the folder. Inside was a single transfer notice. Stamped, signed, legally binding, and dated 3 days before the watch was sold. Daniel leaned forward. What is that? Edward answered calmly. A conditional override. Humiliation spike. Not from me this time. From Daniel. Because I saw it in his face now. He was no longer in control of the story. Edward continued. Your father anticipated financial mismanagement within the family structure. He created a safeguard that transfers control if specific actions are taken without authorization. Lauren's voice rose slightly. This is insane. Edward didn't blink. It is also legal. Silence. A long one. Daniel turned to me again. This is not about you, Mom, he said quickly. This is just complicated paperwork. We were trying to protect your assets. Protect. That word again. Edward closed the folder slightly. Then explain this, he said. He placed a second document on top and pointed. To whom did the proceeds of the watch sale go? No one spoke. Not immediately. Not comfortably. And in that moment, I saw it. Not just hesitation, but fracture. Because Daniel didn't look at me. He looked at Lauren. And Lauren didn't look at Edward. She looked at the table. Edward nodded slightly, as if confirming what he already knew. Then he said quietly, that is the question your husband expected would eventually be answered. And for the first time since this began, I realized this was no longer about what they sold. It was about what they tried to hide after selling it. The room didn't feel like a meeting anymore. It felt like something was being dissected in real time. Edward's last words still hung in the air. That is the question your husband expected would eventually be answered. Daniel broke first. This is ridiculous, he said sharply, pushing back his chair slightly. You're all acting like I stole something. Lauren immediately followed. We didn't steal anything, she said quickly. We managed things. There's a difference. Humiliation spike. Not from the accusation. From the certainty in her voice. Like she genuinely believed control and ownership meant the same thing. Mr. Carter finally spoke again. Then let's clarify something, he said, sliding another document forward. Daniel didn't even look at it. I don't need to see more papers. Edward's voice stayed calm. You do. A pause. Then Edward added, because this one shows where the money went. That changed everything. Lauren froze for half a second too long. Daniel frowned. What money? Edward tapped the document once. The proceeds from the watch sale. Silence. Not empty. Loaded. Daniel exhaled sharply. It went into family expenses, he said quickly. We already explained that. Edward nodded. Yes, that is what you said. Then he turned the page. And this is what the bank records say. He placed it on the table. I looked down. Even before reading it fully, I saw the structure. Transfers. Multiple accounts. Not just one transaction. A pattern. Lauren stepped forward. This is private, she said sharply. Edward looked at her for the first time with something colder than neutrality. No, he said. Not anymore. Humiliation spike. Daniel leaned in. Mom, he said quickly, softer now. Don't let them confuse you. This is just legal noise. But his voice didn't have the same confidence anymore. I kept looking at the paper. My husband's watch. Sold. Converted. Distributed. Not preserved. Not protected. Processed. And then I saw it. One line. A transfer to a name I didn't recognize. I pointed at it. What is this? I asked quietly. Edward followed my finger. His expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Confirmation. This, he said, is where the majority of the funds were redirected. Daniel immediately reacted. That's not possible. I approved only family expenses. Lauren's voice cut in fast. You didn't see all the breakdowns. Daniel turned to her. What do you mean I didn't see them? A pause. Too long. Too heavy. Lauren exhaled. They were consolidated reports. Silence. That word landed like a crack in glass. Consolidated. Meaning simplified. Meaning filtered. Meaning controlled. Humiliation spike. Not loud. Quiet. The kind that builds pressure instead of releasing it. Edward continued. Your father's system required full transparency for any liquidation of assets tied to the trust. He looked at Daniel. That requirement was bypassed. Daniel shook his head. I didn't bypass anything. Edward didn't argue. He just placed another sheet on top. This is the authorization log. I leaned forward slightly. For the first time, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A signature. Not mine. Not Daniel's. Lauren's. Daniel saw it too. His head snapped toward her immediately. What is that? He asked. Lauren didn't answer right away. That silence was different now. Not defensive. Not controlled. Calculated. Edward spoke for her. This signature granted partial access to liquidation accounts. Daniel stared at her. You signed this. Lauren finally spoke. It was to streamline processing. Humiliation spike. The word streamline. Like my husband's legacy was a workflow problem. Daniel's voice dropped. You told me it was just administrative confirmation. Lauren didn't respond. That was worse than denial. That was exposure. Mr. Carter leaned forward slightly. Margaret, he said quietly, there is something else you need to understand. I looked at him. He continued. Your husband didn't just protect the watch. A pause. He protected you from what would happen after it was gone. Silence again. But this one felt different. Not like confusion. Like impact before realization. Edward added one line. The moment the watch was sold, the system began tracking decision integrity. Daniel frowned. What system? Edward answered simply. A test. Lauren stiffened slightly. A test of what? Edward looked at her. Whether the people managing the estate would remain honest when oversight disappeared. Daniel laughed once, but it was broken now. So what? You're saying this was all planned? Edward nodded. Yes. A pause. Then, by your father. Silence. No one spoke. Not Daniel. Not Lauren. Not even me. Because something had shifted. This was no longer about what they took. It was about what they thought they could get away with. And for the first time since I sat down in this room, I realized my husband was not gone from this conversation at all. He was simply watching it unfold in ways none of us understood yet. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition forming too late. Daniel was still staring at Lauren. Not like a husband. Like someone trying to rewrite a memory he no longer trusted. Lauren finally exhaled. Slowly. Controlled. But not calm. This is being taken out of context, she said. No one responded. That silence hurt her more than an argument would have. Edward didn't move. He simply opened another folder. This is the beneficiary mapping, he said. Humiliation spike. The words alone shifted the atmosphere again. Daniel frowned. Beneficiary mapping? Edward nodded. Yes. It shows who ultimately controlled the redirected funds after liquidation. Lauren's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the table. That tiny movement didn't go unnoticed. Not anymore. Edward placed the document down and turned it toward me first. Margaret, he said, this is the part your husband specifically wanted you to see. I looked down. At first, it looked like standard legal structure. Names, accounts, transfers. But then I saw it. A second layer. A recipient structure that wasn't supposed to exist under a simple estate distribution. Daniel leaned forward. What is that? He asked again, but his voice had changed. Less authority. More urgency. Edward didn't answer him immediately. He pointed. Here. One name. Lauren Brooks. My daughter-in-law's name. But not just once. Multiple entries. Daniel froze. No, he said immediately. That's not possible. Lauren's expression didn't change. That was the worst part. No shock. No denial. Just stillness. Edward continued calmly. Your father's system flagged repeated authorization anomalies tied to this account. Humiliation spike. Not loud. Deep. The kind that spread slowly instead of breaking instantly. Daniel turned fully to Lauren now. Tell me this is wrong, he said. Lauren finally looked at him. And for the first time, her voice wasn't controlled. It wasn't what you think. That sentence, that exact sentence, always means the same thing. It means there is something underneath the explanation. Edward slid another page forward. This is the audit trail, he said, then added. It shows direct involvement in the decision to liquidate and redistribute assets without full disclosure. Daniel's breathing changed. Shorter now. You told me this was just paperwork approval, he said. Lauren shook her head slightly. I didn't know everything, she replied quickly. But Edward interrupted. You signed authorization after full disclosure warnings were displayed. Silence. Humiliation spike. This time, it didn't land on me. It landed between them. Daniel leaned back slightly, like the chair had become unstable. You knew? He asked quietly. Lauren didn't answer immediately. That delay was the answer. Mr. Carter finally spoke again. Margaret's husband did not trust single-point authority, he said. He built layered consent requirements specifically to prevent unilateral control. Edward nodded. And those layers were breached. Lauren's voice sharpened again. This is ridiculous. You're acting like we committed a crime. Edward looked at her. Directly. I am stating what the system recorded. A pause. Then he added. And what it recorded is consistent activity. That word again. Consistent. Not accidental. Not isolated. Consistent. Daniel slowly turned his head back toward me. But this time, his voice was different. Lower. Uncertain. Mom, I didn't take anything from you. I didn't respond immediately. Because I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at the document. At names. At patterns. At something I had not been allowed to see while it was happening. Edward spoke softly now. There is one more layer. Lauren immediately reacted. No, she said quickly. There's nothing else. But Edward already reached for the final file. Humiliation spike. This one was different. Because even before it opened, I could feel it. Edward placed it down. This, he said, is the final transfer authorization. Daniel leaned forward again. What final transfer? Edward didn't look at him. He looked at me. Margaret, he said carefully. Your husband left one last instruction. Silence. He turned the page and slid it forward. I saw it. Even before I read it fully, I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. Lauren stopped breathing, because the name on that line was not Lauren, not Daniel. It was a third account, one none of them had mentioned. Edward spoke quietly. This account was created under oversight restriction. A pause. Then, and it activates only when trust violation reaches final threshold. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. What threshold? Edward looked at him and answered, intentional concealment of asset redistribution from the primary beneficiary. Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that moment, I finally understood something I had refused to see until now. This wasn't just about what they sold. It was about how many times they thought I wouldn't notice. And my husband, he had been counting. The room didn't feel like a place for conversation anymore. It felt like a point of collapse that had been delayed too long. Daniel was no longer speaking confidently. Lauren wasn't either. And I was still holding the last document Edward had placed in front of me. The final transfer authorization. My eyes stayed on it longer than they should have, because something about it didn't feel like discovery anymore. It felt like arrival. Edward broke the silence first. This account, he said, tapping the paper lightly, was not meant to be accessed under normal conditions. Daniel's voice came out strained. What does that mean? Not normal conditions? Edward didn't look at him. He looked at me. It means your father expected deception to escalate. Humiliation spike. Not loud. Finalizing. Lauren suddenly spoke, sharper than before. This is ridiculous. You're building a narrative around paperwork. Edward finally turned to her. No, he said. Your actions built the narrative. The paperwork only recorded it. Silence. Heavy. Absolute. Mr. Carter leaned slightly forward. Margaret, he said gently. This is the threshold your husband defined. I didn't respond. Because I already felt it. The shift. The final line being crossed. Edward continued. When the watch was sold, it did not simply trigger financial review. A pause. It triggered behavioral audit activation. Daniel frowned. Behavioral what? Edward answered calmly. A system designed to track intent through financial decisions. Humiliation spike. Not from accusation. From structure. From the idea that every decision had already been weighed against something I was never told existed. Lauren's voice dropped slightly. This is insane surveillance logic. Edward nodded once. Yes. Then added, by design. Silence again. But this one was different. Because now even denial felt weak. Daniel turned fully toward me again. His voice softened. Mom, please. You know me. I looked at him. Really looked. For the first time in this entire room. Not as my son, but as part of a system I was now being shown from the outside. I thought I did, I said quietly. That sentence landed harder than anything Edward had presented so far. Daniel froze. Lauren shifted in her seat. Edward opened the final page. This is the last instruction, he said. No one interrupted him now. Not even Lauren. He placed it in front of me. This account activates only if the system confirms concealment of asset redirection and unauthorized beneficiary assignment. A pause. Then he added, both conditions have now been recorded. Silence. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, that's not possible. Edward looked at him. It already happened. Humiliation spike. Not explosive. Structural. Like something underneath everything finally giving way. Lauren suddenly stood up fully this time. This is being misinterpreted, she said quickly. We never intended. Edward interrupted her. Intent is not what the system evaluates. A pause. Action is. Silence. Daniel's voice cracked slightly now. So what happens now? Edward didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me. Not them. Me. And that was the first moment I understood something important. They were no longer the center of this room. I was. Edward spoke softly. Margaret, your husband gave you final authority. I blinked slowly. Authority over what? I asked. Edward turned the document toward me. Over everything that was redirected. Silence again. But this time, it felt like pressure building toward release. Daniel stepped back slightly. Lauren didn't move at all. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think until this exact moment. They were not reacting to confusion anymore. They were reacting to consequences they could finally see forming. Edward continued. The system does not punish immediately. A pause. It consolidates evidence. Daniel whispered. Evidence of what? Edward answered simply. Control misuse. Humiliation spike. Final stage. Not emotional anymore. Legal. Structural. Permanent. Lauren finally spoke, but her voice was different now. Smaller. What does that mean for us? Edward looked at her. And for the first time, there was no neutrality in his tone. Only clarity. It means, he said, the final instruction is now executable. Silence dropped instantly. No one moved. No one spoke. Even breathing felt controlled. And I sat there, still holding the document, realizing that the last thing my husband ever built was not a will. It was a moment he knew I would eventually have to face. The air in the room had become thin, not quiet, thin, like every word now had to pass through something heavier before it could be spoken. Daniel was standing still, but his posture had changed. Less defensive, more cornered. Lauren wasn't sitting anymore. She was frozen halfway between sitting and standing, as if her body couldn't decide which version of reality to accept. And I was still holding the final document. Edward spoke again. This is the activation stage, he said calmly. No one responded. Not because they didn't hear him, but because they finally understood that everything from this point forward was irreversible. Daniel swallowed hard. Activation of what exactly? He asked, but his voice lacked force. Edward didn't look at him. He looked at me. Execution of the final instruction your father left behind. Humiliation spike. Not emotional anymore. Structural collapse. Lauren suddenly spoke, her voice tighter. This is insane. You're acting like we committed some kind of crime. Edward nodded slightly. That is not a matter of opinion anymore. Silence dropped again. He opened the final page fully. And for the first time, I saw the entire structure at once. Not fragments. Not sections. The full design. Edward pointed. Your husband defined 3 conditions, he said. 1. Unauthorized sale of protected asset. He looked at Daniel. Confirmed. 2. Misrepresentation of financial distribution. He glanced at Lauren. Confirmed. A pause. 3. Concealment of beneficiary flow. Silence. That one lingered longer than the others, because no one could deny it anymore. Edward continued. All 3 conditions activate final clause execution. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Final clause means what? Edward finally answered without hesitation. It means the system transfers full control of the remaining estate to Margaret Brooks. Silence. Complete silence. Not shock. Not confusion. Displacement. Lauren suddenly shook her head. No, she said quickly. That can't be right. Edward slid another document forward. It is already recorded. Daniel stepped closer to the table now, eyes scanning the page. And I saw it happen in real time. The moment understanding became panic. Because it wasn't just legal wording. It was confirmation. Irreversible transfer language. Timestamped. Authorization triggers. Digital validation seals. All pointing in one direction. Me. Daniel looked up at me slowly. Mom, he said quietly. This is not what we did. I held his gaze. And for the first time, I didn't respond immediately. Because something inside me had already stopped treating this as an argument. It was no longer about explanation. It was about consequence. Lauren suddenly spoke again, faster now. This is being misread. We didn't hide anything. We just reorganized assets for efficiency. Edward interrupted her instantly. That is not what the audit shows. Humiliation spike. Sharp. Final layer. Daniel turned toward Lauren. This time, not confusion. Not hesitation. But something closer to realization. What did you do? He asked quietly. Lauren froze. For half a second. That half second told everything. She tried to recover immediately. I did what was necessary, she said quickly. You were overwhelmed. I handled the paperwork. Edward shook his head. That is not what the authorization log shows. He turned the page and placed it in front of Daniel. Your signature appears on only partial disclosures. A pause. Everything else was approved under her credentials. Silence. Daniel stared at her. Not angry yet. Not fully. Just disoriented. Why? He asked. Lauren didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, the room changed again. Because now it wasn't about documents. It was about intent. Edward spoke softly. Your husband anticipated this exact moment. I looked up at him. For what reason? I asked quietly. Edward met my eyes. Because he knew trust would be tested after his death. Humiliation spike. But not mine. Theirs. Daniel whispered again. So what happens now? Edward answered without hesitation. Now the final instruction is executed. Lauren suddenly stepped forward. No, wait, she said quickly. We can fix this. We can reverse. Edward cut her off. It is not reversible. Silence dropped again. But this time, it wasn't just heavy. It was final. And I realized something sitting there in that room. They were no longer arguing about what had happened. They were reacting to something that had already moved past them. Edward turned to me one last time. Margaret, he said quietly, your husband left you one final choice. I looked at him. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood. This was never about what they sold. It was about what I was willing to see once everything was exposed. The room didn't move for a full 5 seconds after Edward spoke. No one breathed normally. No one reacted like a conversation was still happening. Because it wasn't. It was already ending. Edward looked at me one final time. Margaret, he said quietly, your husband left you full authority to execute the final clause. I stared at him. Not at Daniel. Not at Lauren. At him. Because in that moment, I finally understood something deeper than documents. This was never just about money. It was about what kind of person I would still be when I finally knew everything. Daniel stepped forward slightly. Mom. Please, he said, his voice lower now. Don't do this. We can fix it. We can talk. Lauren interrupted immediately. Daniel, stop. She's not going to, but she stopped mid-sentence. Because I had already moved. Slowly, I placed the final document flat on the table. The room tightened instantly. Edward didn't rush me. He simply said, "You only need to confirm." I looked at the paper, at the structure my husband had built, at the system that had been watching long before I even understood I was being tested, and I realized something simple. They weren't asking for forgiveness anymore. They were waiting for consequence. I exhaled slowly, and I spoke. Executed. Silence. Not dramatic. Not loud. Absolute. Daniel froze. Lauren's face went still. Even Edward didn't immediately move. Then he nodded once. Understood, he said. He pressed a small confirmation on his tablet, and everything changed. Not visually, not loudly, but structurally. Lauren took a step back. What does that mean? She asked quickly. What did you just do? Edward answered calmly. It means every unauthorized transfer is now frozen. Daniel's breath stopped for a second. Frozen. That word landed heavier than anything else. Lauren turned sharply. No, that's not possible. We already. Edward interrupted her. Already does not matter anymore. Humiliation spike. Final stage. Daniel looked at me again. But this time, not as a son trying to explain. As someone realizing he no longer had control over the outcome. Mom, he said again, softer. Please, we didn't mean for it to go this far. I looked at him, and for the first time, my voice didn't carry confusion. Only clarity. You did not lose control today, I said quietly. A pause. You lost it when you stopped asking me before making decisions about my life. Silence. Lauren's expression tightened. Daniel looked down. For the first time. Edward continued. There is one final step, he said. Lauren immediately reacted. What else is there? She asked, panic now breaking through. Edward turned the screen toward me. Legal reinstatement of asset ownership confirmation. He paused. And public estate reclassification. Daniel frowned. Public. Edward nodded. Yes. As per your husband's instruction, once the final clause is executed, all concealed transfers must be disclosed to the estate registry. Silence dropped again, this time heavier. Permanent. Lauren whispered. You're exposing everything. Edward corrected her gently. No, he looked at me. Your husband ensured everything would eventually correct itself. A pause. Then, whether anyone was ready or not, Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was barely above a whisper. So what happens to us now? That question hung in the air longer than anything else before it. Edward answered simply. That is no longer determined by you. A silence followed, and for the first time since this entire room began collapsing around us, there was nothing left to argue about. Lauren slowly sat down again, as if her legs could no longer support certainty. Daniel didn't move. I stayed still, but inside me, something had already settled. Not victory, not revenge, understanding, because I finally saw what my husband had done. He didn't just leave behind instructions. He left behind a mirror, and for the first time in a long time, I saw exactly who had been standing in front of me all along. Edward closed the final folder gently. It is done, he said. No one responded. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been revealed.